Welcome to this audio session recording taken at the Agroforestry Show, which was organised in September 2023 as a partnership between the Woodland Trust and the Soil Association. For more session recordings, go to agroforestryshow.com or explore and subscribe to the Agroforestry Show YouTube channel. Enjoy!
My name is Martin Lukács. I work at the University of Reading and I was asked to chair this session, so I am just your host really. I will not do much more than that. The real meat comes from the four speakers today. Prior to setting up the session, we were wondering how much of an introduction to agroforestry we should do. So I wanted to ask, is there anybody who has not heard of agroforestry in the room? Okay. I'll come and talk to you, sir. I'll explain everything. So it's 4 talks. The idea for the session is to give you the presentation of where the research is, hence the title, The Great Research Roundup. They are all either students or postdocs at the university. So they'll show you what we do. And then one of the things I wanted to ask you is to think how we could take whatever you'll see today and transform it into something that is accessible to the end user. So how somebody can actually use this knowledge that we produce. Okay, this is our daily bread, but we understand that people need to use whatever we come up with. So that's the task for you here. Okay, so 4 speakers. They have been given 10 minutes each for their session. 2 of them are PhD students at the University of Reading, and I am the director of the PhD program, so it will be 10 minutes. I have the means to check that. So if you have any question, keep your questions for later, write them down if your memory is as good as mine, or just remember the question. Once they finish their 4 10-minute speeches or talks, then we can have a question and answer session. Okay, I hope that's all right. So I'll stop speaking now. And we go to our first speaker, which is Rosie.
Hello, so I'm Rosie Scholes. I'm based at the University of Reading, and I'm going to talk to you about my research, which is how does silver arable agroforestry contribute to healthy and resilient soils. I'm doing a PhD at the moment. I'm just coming up to the end of my first year, so I'll talk a little bit about what I'm going to do and share some really initial results. I'll give you a bit of context, talk about my main research question, which is a really, really broad soil health assessment on silver arable farms in the UK. I'll go into the methods a bit, share some nice photos from my fieldwork, and then share some initial results on earthworm abundance and species richness, and then give you a really little snippet of what I'm going to be up to in the future as well. I won't stress the context as it's the last session of the Agroforestry Show, so I'm sure you will know most of this. Interest in these systems is growing. I think this event is a huge testament to that. But despite that, we don't have a huge amount of empirical evidence of what is happening to the soil in silver arable systems. So I'm trying to plug that gap, as soil is really, really important. My main research question, I've been working with the Woodland Trust and LEAF and many practicing silver arable farmers in the UK. Some of their logos are up there, Stephen Briggs, Wakelands, and Mike from Maple Farm as well, and others, to try and make this research really, really relevant to farmers. And we basically come up with the first question: does silver arable farming with fruit and nut trees provide benefits to soil health compared to arable farming? And I'm focusing on fruit and nut trees, as this is the type of tree that farmers are typically planting in silver arable systems in the UK at the moment. So it's hopefully the research is going to be of most use to them, but also there are a lot of sites with fruit and nut trees available to actually study. So to answer this, I'm doing a really broad soil health assessment. I'm looking at physical measures, chemical measures, biological measures, and a little bit to do with how the crop's doing as well, yield and crop quality. I'm looking at 5 mature farms over 2 years. I've put mature silver arable. This is slightly arbitrary, because how do you know when a system is mature? But I've said trees were planted over 8 years ago, partly due to the sites that were available to get the maximum sample size. And I'm looking at all these measures over 2 years. And so all of the farms that I'm looking at have paired arable control fields on site. So that's a field that's managed in exactly the same way with the same crop rotation that just doesn't have tree rows, essentially, so that we can make those direct comparisons, as soil is really variable place to place. So try and understand exactly what the agroforestry is doing. And for those who aren't familiar with silver arable, this picture bottom left is sort of looking down an alley. So the trees there would be rows of trees, and then there's a big row of crops in the middle. And to get a spatial image of what's going on in the soil, I'm doing different sampling points. So I've got 4 sampling points, 1 in the tree row near the tree, 1 at the edge of the crop alley, 1 5 metres into the crop alley, and 1 in the middle of the crop alley. So hopefully this will give us a spatial view of what's going on. And I'm doing exactly the same in the fields that don't have agroforestry, the arable fields, to compare. And so these are all the measures that I'm looking at. There's quite a lot there. I'm not going to talk about them all because I'll be here for days. But yeah, if anyone wants to talk to me about any of those after, I'm happy to chat about them. But I'm just going to focus from now on earthworm abundance and species diversity, as I've got some data to share. So yeah, some pictures from my first field season. So I was out this spring for the best part of 3 months, pretty much, sampling earthworms and collecting data on many of these other measures. You can see a nice healthy worm in the bottom there. And so earthworms are hugely important for soil health. They're a really, really fantastic indicator, as they're essential in so many different soil processes. They're really important for nutrient cycling. Their burrows are really important for water regulation in the soil. They're fantastic at aerating the soil, so they're really key to a lot of processes that go on. So yeah, a lot of worms in the system is a good indication that soil is healthy. Also, earthworm diversity. So we have 31 species of earthworm in the UK, but there are only 2 of these that are really, really common in arable systems that take up the vast proportion of the species in arable systems, which means that we're sort of lacking resilience in those earthworms. If something was to come and take one of those species out, there's not much resilience there, basically. So improving earthworm diversity is really important, as well as improving earthworm numbers. And so, preliminary results. These, I really want to stress, they're just from 3 farms out of the 5 I'm studying, as I am still identifying a lot of the worms at the moment. I just wanted to pull some interesting data for you today. And they're just from 1 season. So I will, as my PhD goes on, get a lot more data and feed this into it. So hopefully we'll have another one of these shows in a few years, and I can share more data with you on earthworms and other soil health measures. But we've got some interesting results already. So just from these 3 farms, this graph is just showing the average number of earthworms per metre squared. So on the left is the agroforestry, and the right is the control. And there are significantly more worms in the agroforestry than the control, just based on earthworm total numbers, which is a really, really positive start from those 3 farms. And then looking at this spatially in the agroforestry tree rows and out into the crop alley, interestingly, there's no significant difference. So someone might sort of suggest that all these earthworms are concentrated in the tree row and not into the crop alley, but it's not looking like that's the case so far. It is from a limited range of data, so we'll see how this looks when I add more data in. But this is sort of indicating that it might be a field scale effect, which is, again, good, because if the worms were all concentrated in the tree row, they're not really adding much to the cropping system necessarily. But it looks like it might be a field scale effect. And then looking at the earthworm species, so this is the average number of earthworm species per sample. There aren't any significant differences yet in the number in the agroforestry compared to the control, even in a spatial picture. But when looking at the actual species that are there, this is quite a lot going on in this graph. So if you just look at the 4 bars on the right to start, so these are the control field, and a big proportion of that is the purple and the navy, which are the 2 most common species in the UK. This is sort of exactly what we would expect to see in these arable sites. But looking at the agroforestry, comparing that, there are less, particularly of the navy species, the chlorotica, and that is not just in the tree row, but extending out into the cropping area as well, which is quite interesting. And as hopefully you can see, purely by the spread of colours there are more diverse species in the agroforestry, in the cropping area and the tree row. And a better spread. So that really builds resilience into these systems. If one of these species was to have anything like health or any kind of risk that affects the species, there is a lot more resilience in the agroforestry than the control. And yeah, with more data and more analysis, hopefully this will come out even stronger. So that was a really quick overview of earthworm results so far, but it's looking good is the conclusion. So my future work, I'll just talk about it very quickly. Again, I'm going to be looking a lot at resilience in these systems in the soil. So my sort of next research question I'm about to embark on is, does silver arable farming provide benefits to soil water regulation at the farm scale? So this is thinking about drought resilience and resilience to flooding in these systems. And I'm going to be installing deep access tubes to go and basically measure what's going on in the soil water throughout a year at 2 farms, and then comparing this to microclimatic data from above ground as well. And then I'm also going to be doing a small manipulation experiment on some farms. Hopefully you can see this picture down in the bottom right, which is essentially a cold frame kind of style thing that's been designed by another researcher at the University of Reading. And it's been designed to warm up the soil to sort of mimic climate change without affecting the sun too much or the humidity in there, so it's just warming the soil. We're just doing some preliminary experiments at the moment to check that it is doing what we think it's doing. But the idea is we can put some of these into the silver arable systems and the controls and have a look at how the crop and the soil might respond as the temperature increases, and how the silver arable might be improving the resilience of these systems to changing temperatures. And just before I go, I just want to plug this other workshop that is coming up. My fantastic supervisor, Millie, who's here, is running alongside Farm Ed as part of the Treescapes programme. And it's a 2-day workshop, and you can basically get a training day on agroforestry design and get some bespoke plans for your farm. There's a great range of speakers, and I think there are leaflets floating around, so yeah, grab a leaflet if you're interested. And that's me. Hopefully that was less than 10 minutes. Thank you all.
Thank you. Erika is next.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Erika Degani. I'm a postdoc at Reading University. I actually started I did my undergrad dissertation on agroforestry when it was really at the fringes. So it's really nice to see that it has a whole show dedicated to it now, and it's rising up the political agenda. So it's really exciting. So I'm working at the Agroforestry Futures project, which is part of the Treescapes program. And my role within the project is to write a systematic review on the impact of European agroforestry on ecosystem services at different spatial scales. So it's basically to gather the evidence that is out there and compile it and put it together so we can pass it on to decision makers and policy makers to make the best of it and to make decisions based on the knowledge that is out there. So I'm going to give you some context as to why we're doing it, I'll then talk about how we're doing it, and finally just talk briefly about what we want to achieve. So what is the FIRST all about? I think apart from one person, everybody knows what agroforestry is, so I'm not going to go into much detail in terms of defining it, but I think the message that we need to put out there is that agroforestry is a regenerative practice, so it puts back into the system, as opposed to the extractive model that we have out there at the moment, which was devised and put in place when the problems we had were completely different than the problems we have right now. So I think that we need to bring in systems, and agroforestry is certainly one of them, that address the actual problems we have. With the push for net zero targets, with the post-Brexit subsidy schemes being rewritten, there is a good opportunity for us to put agroforestry up the agenda, get the evidence out there, and change the status quo. So in terms of the review, we are reviewing the impact of different agroforestry systems. So we are looking at alicropy, which I'm going to go briefly through what they mean, but I assume that you're probably familiar with those, but in case you are not. So alicropy basically consists of rows of trees with alleys in the middle, in which either horticultural crops or arable crops are produced. We also reviewing the impact of windbreaks and shelter belts, which are basically, again, rows, one or more rows of closely spaced trees and or shrubs planted at a right angle to the prevailing winds, so that they protect the crops. So they protect wind-sensitive crops. They retain more water in the system, and they protect animals if it's a livestock system. We're also looking at riparian buffers. So this is vegetation that is along the bank of streams going into the riparian zone. And they basically serve as buffers to pollutant coming from agricultural, mainly from agricultural runoff into these water bodies. They also provide a very important habitat for biodiversity. We're also reviewing silvopastoral systems, which are basically the combination of livestock and trees in pastures mainly. These trees can be spaced widely out of the pasture or be clustered together depending on the type of system. And finally, we're also looking at the impact of forest farming. So forest farming is basically cultivating crops in the understory layer of either planted or natural woodlands, which are then managed for both timber and the understory crop. And what we're doing is measuring the effect of, or not measuring, sorry, we're not measuring, we're getting the data that is out there and compiling the evidence of other people's work on the impact of these agroforestry systems on different ecosystem services. So if you haven't heard about ecosystem services, we've got different types, and these are services provided to us by nature. We've got supporting ecosystem services, which basically underpin all the other services. So they're things like nutrient cycling, soil formation, primary production. So they are ecosystem functions, basically. We have regulating ecosystem services, so these are things like climate regulation, flood regulation, pollination also comes under regulating ecosystem services. Provisioning services, which is basically what we get out of the system, so yield of food, fiber, fuel, and so on. And we also have cultural services, which the aesthetic value of the systems or the recreational value of the systems or the value to our mental health. There's a lot of research that's coming out now saying that spending time in nature is good for us in terms of our mental health. Unfortunately, for logistical reasons, we are not including cultural services in the review. But there are some reviews out there that have looked at the impact of agroforestry systems on these cultural ecosystem services, albeit not at different spatial scales, but the information is out there if you're interested. So why are we doing it? There has been a couple of reviews that have looked at the impact of European agroforestry on biodiversity and ecosystem services. So there's been a meta-analysis published recently and a systematic map. So this information is already out there, but we went a step further and added another layer to it, and we wanted to know if that is different at different spatial scales. So this has been a knowledge gap that has been identified by one of those reviews, and we are trying to address that gap in knowledge with our review. And those reviews, if you're interested, have quite a lot of work in them, and they concluded that there is an overall positive effect of agroforestry on ecosystem services, that agroforestry is enhanced, that things like erosion, biodiversity, and soil fertility are enhanced by agroforestry. The deal with yield is a bit more complicated. There is a lot of knowledge gaps out there as well, so there is no clear effect on provisioning ecosystem services, which is effectively yield. So there is some biases in terms of the countries and the geographical areas where research has been carried out. So there's a lot that we still don't know. But for now, what we're trying to address is that knowledge gap in terms of these different spatial scales. And when I talk about different spatial scales, a farmer might decide to convert just a field of their farm into an agroforestry system, or they might decide to convert the whole farm into an agroforestry system. And how will it differ in terms of the impact on biodiversity and ecosystem services? So that's what we're trying to establish. And in terms of landscape scale, we were also going to try and get to landscape scale. So what is the impact of an area where there's a cluster of farms that have been converted to agroforestry, as opposed to an area where there's no trees, and how these differ. The problem is that there is very little primary research out there in terms of landscape scale data, so we need to rely on model predictions for this, but we're going to try and get as much data as we can and have it compiled in the review. So in terms of methodology, how we do it, the first step is to identify a knowledge gap, which we have done. 1 minute. Okay. We identify a knowledge gap. I'm almost there. We then write a systematic protocol, which takes ages. You'd think it's simple, but it takes ages. We then select the studies, and then from the selected studies, we then have to keep on selecting them based on inclusion and exclusion criteria, and also the quality of these studies. So we end up with a few studies that we're then going to extract data from, discuss, write conclusions, and then hopefully disseminate the results to stakeholders. And what we want to achieve, we want it to have an impact. We want it to inform policymakers, and especially now that we have an opportunity to write it into the subsidy schemes and push it and educate farmers and make it happen, basically, because we know that the benefits are there, that there is lots of benefits that come from it. And the idea is to inform decision makers and hopefully use it to address the climate and biodiversity crisis that we are facing. And agroforestry is not a one-size-fits-all solution, but it's definitely a very important tool, and we need to make use of it. So yes, a minute. Thank you. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Sally Westaway. I'm a part-time PhD student based at Royal Agricultural University. And the subject of my PhD, which, thanks Erika, you've set me up really nicely actually, is ecosystem service provision of trees on farms at a landscape scale. So I'm going to give a bit of an overview of my research approach and my questions. I was hoping to give a bit of an examples of some of the results from the survey that some of you may have seen. I've been trying to sort of circulate it quite widely. I'm not sure I'm going to do that because I haven't been able to update the slides, but anyway, we'll see. So my PhD is building on the UK government's tree planting aspirations and examining the role of agricultural land in reaching these targets. So afforestation targets, they're nothing new. They've been around for ages, since after First World War, when it was self-sufficiency in timber was the goal. Now they're more about climate change emission abatement. And most of you will probably know these figures, but the UK government committed to creating 30,000 hectares of new woodland per year by 2025. That's really soon, and I don't think it's anywhere near that. We're anywhere near that. But the most recent target in England, which is legally binding currently, is to increase canopy cover, so a bit of a difference, canopy cover from 14.5% to 16.5% by 2050. This is an increase of around 250,000 hectares. So when you look at land use in the UK, though, most of our land is used as agricultural land, over 70%, and the remaining land is either already afforested or not really suitable for tree planting. So in the light of these tree planting targets and the shortage of land for these trees, my research aims to identify a spatial configuration of trees in the farm landscape that deliver for multiple ecosystem services. And I'm not including the whole suite that Erika just talked about. I'm looking particularly at food production, carbon storage and sequestration, and biodiversity. Got the following 3 research questions. So how are trees and hedges contributing to the carbon balance of case study farms? So this is based on a series of actual farms. And where would we cite new tree planting within those farms to maximise carbon sequestration? And then what are the trade-offs and synergies between this carbon sequestration and food production and biodiversity? And then can a well-designed agroforestry system or additional trees on those farms provide these services whilst also being economically viable? So we talked about who knows what agroforestry is. I don't think the definition is that simple. I define it really widely as every tree on a farm, pretty much. And I'm interested in the ability of agroforestry to bridge the divide between the need for land to produce food and plant trees, and this has probably been talked about in policy sessions, to unite sort of agricultural and forestry policy. I also think trees planted in the right place can really help farmers become more resilient in the face of climate change. And as we need to increase tree cover and strengthen the resilience of agricultural systems, agroforestry can do both. I don't think I need to say that to you lot, though. So this is my methodology for my PhD. I'm using a series of case study farms, 3 different case study farms. I'm collecting field data on them. Just about finished my field data collection now. And I'm giving a baseline of current ecosystem service provision provided by those trees on those farms. I'm then going to combine this data with national data sets and whole farm assessments and modelling to generate some increased tree cover scenarios on these farms based on the 10% of increased tree cover that the Climate Change Committee sort of suggest is ideal for most farms. I've got a stakeholder consultation process, of which there's a survey that I've circulated at this Agroforestry Show. And then following the survey, there'll be a series of workshops as well to sort of ground truth and check that what I'm doing actually is meaningful in the real world as well. And then the final stage, and I haven't really thought about this yet, but I'd like to do it, is to scale up to a regional or catchment-based level, and there's been some useful sessions in this conference giving me some ideas towards that. So my case study farms, I've got 3 at the moment. I'm sort of maybe going to add in some more, I'm not sure. I'm focusing on these 3 to start off with. So Yatesbury House Farm, which is predominantly arable farm, not too far from here. It's got a 6-year arable rotation. He's also got some cattle. He's got mixed boundaries, hedges, some farm woodland and some agroforestry. Leeworthy Manor Farm, and some of you may have heard Henry from Leeworthy talk at this conference. So it's a Devon farm, Devon livestock farm. It's part of the Silver Pasture Field Lab as well. It's got mixed boundaries, some planted agroforestry and a small area of woodland grazing. And then finally, Tilhill Organics, a diverse horticulture operation outside Oxfordshire, which also has agroforestry and boundaries and hedges and various different trees. So This is Leeworthy. This is one of my trial fields. You can see one of the shelter belts that was planted under the Silver Pasture Field Lab there. And yeah, this one is Yatesbury, again another one of my trial fields. It's a field of oats, I think, and you're looking out and you can see one of the tree strips in the background. So I've just about finished my data collection. I was going to take this slide out and someone told me to keep it in because I think it's a bit horrific, so I apologise, but hopefully it might be useful. I've sort of like that side of the screen shows the data I've collected so far from the case study farms, and then what I'm going to do with it and how I'm going to build up the sort of spatial models, I guess, with those farms. So the carbon will be built up from soil samples. I've taken soil samples down to 50 centimetres depth. I've measured leaf litter. I've done crop and biomass cuts, and I've looked at tree and hedge measurements as well. The biodiversity is a combination of sort of landscape scale diversity and then finer scale diversity, looking at botanical diversity. And then the productivity is a combination of agricultural and tree yields. So that will enable me to hopefully map the baseline and then generate these additional plus 10% tree cover scenarios. I'm going to use a series of modelling approaches to fast forward in time to see what will happen as the trees grow, basically. So this is Leeworthy House Farm. I sort of slapped these slides together as an illustrative purpose. They're not what I'm actually doing, but I thought it might be quite useful. I've missed out a field as well. You'll see it when it pops up. So tree and hedge cover on the farm is 5.5 hectares, roughly, at the moment. They've planted some agroforestry, some shelter belts, and some alley cropping. So if you want to add 10% tree cover, if we include this agroforestry, that includes another approximately 2 hectares. And then from there, you've got these different scenarios that you can look at. So you could plant shelter belts down the western edge where the predominant wind direction comes. You could take this field, which is quite wet, out of production and put that into trees. Or you could look at a sort of silver pasture infield tree system. I haven't got any initial results, really. I've got piles of data waiting to be entered and processed. But I was working with a master's student at RAU, and he was looking at the difference in soil carbon density between field edges, between field edges which were just grass, hedges, field margins, and field samples. So he was just focusing on the hedges versus the no hedges edges, and then going out into the field as well, down to 50 centimetres. No significant difference were found. Haven't actually looked back through all his data yet, but he hasn't found, which I'm quite surprised about, to be honest. Like, I would expect a difference between the edge and the middle of an arable field, and I would also expect a difference between a hedge and a grass margin. But he did find soil organic carbon decreased with depth. That's, yeah, not surprising. So this is the slide I was going to replace, and I had some initial results, but I didn't get around to replacing it. So I'm circulating a farm survey. I'm looking at identifying preferred increased tree cover scenarios. So it's quite a simple survey. It takes about 5 minutes to do, and it asks basically about whether you, as a farmer, intend to plant trees or not, and where you are in the next 50 years. And then has a series of photographs as well with different increased tree cover options that you can click on and choose, which I've categorised. If you haven't already, please complete it and share. I had 15 responses on Saturday, and that's when I put a slide together that isn't showing. But it did show actually a bit of a difference as well. So horticulture and mixed farms had more of a preference for integrated systems. When they were choosing the photographs, they were choosing more integrated systems. And I'm defining an integrated system as an alley cropping system or trees in the field grazing around it. That word, can't think of it right now, system. And then a separate system as a woodland or a hedge. Yeah, if you haven't already, Martin stood up, so I'm thinking I've got to hurry up. Please complete it and share it. In terms of research outputs, hopefully the useful bits I will be adding to the evidence base for farmers, practitioners and policymakers to help inform establishment of trees. Also, hopefully giving some practical data, which will help farmers decide where to locate their trees. And then this is an ideal. I've seen a lot of things and been thinking about it quite a lot. But a new spatial model on a farm scale. I guess the difference between some of the work here is this will be very much farm-based, allowing comparisons to be made of different tree cover scenarios. And then this is something I think you asked us to do, which was challenges to the wider adoption of agroforestry. And there are so many, but I just wrote down the ones that came to the top of my mind here. And I guess part of my literature review was looking at government policies and how historical targets and how they have or haven't been met and how policies role in this. And I think really, in order to achieve these targets, it relies on substantial landowner behaviour change, more people thinking agroforestry is a good idea, more farmers thinking tree planting is a good idea. And there's been a bit of confusion and bureaucracy associated with government support schemes that's put a lot of people off, I think, previously. I think this hopefully something that my PhD will add towards, and it's a work in progress for a lot of different places as well. We need better methods to assess the contribution of trees and hedges on individual farms, on a farm scale basically, to the carbon balance of that farm. I also part-time run a market garden, and we've planted an agroforestry system, and that's been a bit of an eye-opener. Tree care is a different skill set to annual crops and vegetables. You can't take them out and do it again the next year in a different way. And I think that also system design is very farm specific, and advice and guidance needs to be tailored to individual farms. Okay, thanks for listening. And my next slide had the survey link there, so please fill in the survey. It's only for farmers though.
Thank you, Martin. Thanks. Yeah, my name is Rafael Pompa. I'm a PhD student at the University of Reading. And following the ecosystem services narrative, I'm doing a PhD on assessing ecosystem services in an agroforestry system. But for this presentation, I will be focusing on soil ecosystem services. So I'm working with a European elder tree alley cropping system in the southwest. Elder tree is a plant that has a long history and tradition on medicinal purposes. During or after COVID, the products made by berry or with berry syrups were very popular. The flowers are also a crop, and they are used to prepare all sorts of drinks. In a recent market review, it's forecasted that the global market for this crop is increasing or will increase almost 7% from the 23-27 period. In Europe, it's mostly economically used or explored in continental Europe. In the US, it's much more common to use in agroforestry systems. But despite all the potential benefits, medicinal benefits, and economic financial benefits, little is known about the biology, ecology of this plant, and even less is known about the impact of this plant in agroforestry systems, in soil parameters. So with this in mind, we documented a series of soil functions, impact of these trees on these functions. We analyzed soil organic distribution and soil organic matter. We compare these results with an adjacent apple agroforestry system. And if I have time, I will present some information about soil water content in two contrasting conditions in the elderberry plantation. So we work in a 20 hectare alley cropping system, trees in rows. The crop area is managed on a 7 years arable silage rotation, and the trees, effectively the field has two different agroforestry systems, and we collected a series of soil samples from different distances from the trees at different depths. In this chart, what you see at the top is the percentage of carbon. On the left-hand side vertical axis, you see the two depths we work with, and the square on the left shows the 2018 results, which is effectively 1 year after the trees were planted. And then I went back last year to measure the amount of carbon in 2022. And I found, as you can see on the right-hand side box, more carbon at the top layer. So I then went to compare elders and apples. It's like a pears, apples and pears, but this is elders and apples. So on the left-hand side, you see the soil organic concentration separated by tree rows and crop areas. And the first thing that we can see is that both apples and elders have more carbon in the tree row area in comparison with the crop areas. But another interesting result is that apples have actually more soil organic carbon than elder trees, which is something I wasn't expecting, if I'm honest. I then went to calculate soil organic carbon stocks, and what I found is that the elder berries or elder trees are capturing almost 6 tons of carbon per hectare per year just in the tree row area. If we add the crop area, it will be capturing around 11 tons of carbon just for the 40 centimeters column, soil column. The apple system is capturing a bit more than 8 tons, and together both systems will be collecting around 26 tons per hectare per year just for this field. This other chart shows the results for soil organic carbon pre and post planting. So on the left-hand side, you see the soil organic matter loss on ignition. The red column, it's the amount of soil organic matter in the soil before the trees were planted. The green column shows the amount of soil organic matter in the crop area after the trees were planted. And the blue bar is showing the results of soil organic matter for the tree rows after the trees were planted. So as you can see, there is an increase after you plant trees and manage the crop on their organic principles in terms of soil organic matter. So we found a data set that was collected by Kieran Benton in 2022. He basically collected, he dug some holes and counted the amount of worms in the same holes that I dug. And this flashy chart that you see in here, on the left-hand side, you see the number of worms. At the bottom horizontal axis, you see the number of, the amount of carbon. And basically what it means is the more carbon you have, the more worms you have, which it will be really good to see some of your results on this, Rosie. We then went to, we ran an experiment in terms of, we wanted to know what was the effect of having trees in the ground over soil water content. So we put a series of sensors in an area in the elder agroforestry system that is exposed to the wind, and an area that is sheltered from the wind. And this data is from March to September 2022, so it went all the way through the first heat wave we had last year. So these results are come from an extreme climatic event. And what we noticed was that initially the shelter condition has more water in the tree row in the column 0 to 40 centimeters than when you compare it to an exposed area. But also we noticed that the 0 to 40 centimeters amount of water in the soil is much more homogeneous or much more constant, whereas in an exposed area what you can see is that the top layer is actually getting drier quicker. As a conclusion, this is the first study, as far as I know, to document elder and apple agroforestry systems' contribution to soil organic carbon capture in agroforestry systems in England. According to the data that I found, I could say that elder trees have a positive impact on ecosystem services provision. And, however, the apple agroforestry system could potentially be capturing a bit more or more carbon, significantly more carbon than the elder agroforestry system. Also, well, there is an indication that organic carbon correlates as expected with the amount of worms in soil, and that soil water, as I was mentioning, indicates that in the tree rows area that are not exposed to the wind are much more resilient. So it's an interesting result. It's not just about having trees, but probably having them in the right condition and probably this is important for agroforestry design. So some of the challenges I found in my research is that there is really no much information on sites before the trees are in the ground. So if you're thinking to plant trees, it would be really good to have basic data or baseline data to compare after several years. Something that I also didn't do is that I didn't measure above ground biomass, so I could potentially be underestimating the amount of carbon that is captured in the system as a whole, considering the tree's biomass. By the time when I started doing this research 5 years ago, there wasn't really many agroforestry systems around, so it was difficult for me to find other systems to compare with. There are certainly not many elder agroforestry systems in the country, so the results are given in a highly localized context. And the next steps for me are to validate data for soil water content comparing apples and elders, and also finalize the macronutrient analysis, because it's not just about carbon. That's a very important message I want to leave as well. If we want to transition towards a more soil smart agriculture, we need to think as a whole in several parameters, which I hope agroforestry can help on this instance. And that's me. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening. All the presentations we prepared for you today. The main thing we want to illustrate is that we have all this information about agroforestry. We have ideas about agroforestry. So I go around and I say, look, it's going to be great. It's going to do a lot of stuff. The challenge always is, but prove it. So this proof comes from studies such as this. And I guess one of the most difficult bits is that if you look under the bonnet of the science, it's always, I have taken a soil sample here, and maybe I have taken a soil sample there, and I have a sensor on the tree. So it's always a point measurement, and the challenge is, how is this going to work for the whole field? How is this going to work for the whole farm? And if I'm talking to a politician, the question is, yes, but if all the farmers do this, how is this going to work for the entire landscape? So if we go across the scales from my little measurement here and there to the landscape, there is always a challenge. So one thing we wanted to illustrate is this challenge. We have these measurements, but somehow we have to make them, turn them into a big picture. And that's what we're trying to do. So that's kind of, I'll try to summarize the 4 talks for you. So as I promised, this is your chance to ask questions. So anything you want to ask the speakers here, this is the opportunity.
Thank you. Thanks to all the speakers. Really interesting. It's a very specific question, actually, for Rosie. So I think you were presenting that the diversity of earthworm species had increased in the non-control plot, so the plot where the agroforestry trees are. What's your hypothesis? Is that to do with the cultivation? And if so, what was going on in the control plot in terms of cultivation?
Yeah, good question. So I guess there's a lot of reasons that earthworms could be increased in the agroforestry. As Rafael was saying, carbon, there's a correlation there between increased soil organic carbon, and there's more root exudates from the trees, a more sheltered microclimate in the agroforestry, potentially correlating with the earthworms. More habitats for earthworms to take refuge in the tree row as well. So yeah, lots of things there. And yeah, as I'm analysing the other soil measures, I will look at those correlations as well.
Yeah, I was specifically interested in the diversity of the species, because I was wondering if the 2 that are dominant in arable systems, is that because they're the ones that can cope with cultivation, and the others respond better when it's managed in a different way? Or maybe I'm making up your research here, but that's what I'm interested in.
It's a good question, and I need to look into that. Yeah, to be honest, I pieced these results together really quickly for this show, so I haven't really dug into them that much yet. And yeah, I need to go and look at the what all those species are doing and where they are commonly found otherwise, and yeah, try and understand that picture more. So hopefully we'll have another show and I can tell you more about it.
Can I just say something? I'm not a specialist in worms at all, and I don't know much, but I've been reading some stuff that there are some species that are more ubiquitous in arable fields. So some people actually haven't found differences between control areas and agroforestry systems. And apparently that has something to do with the management of the land as well. Some worms could be more resilient to, for example, minimum tillage or some tillage. So depending on the species, there are different responses. So I wouldn't say, from what I've seen, is not a clear kind of black and white answer, but it depends on several factors. Land management is certainly one of them.
Can I just add to that in the sites that we're working in, the management is the same between the arable and agroforestry fields. So the cultivation practices are the same. The only thing that's different is the tree rows.
Just a comment, really. It strikes me that the only way we're actually going to modulate field temperatures is planting large trees with big volumes of cool air beneath and creating convection currents. And so much what I've heard here and one or two other talks has been about agro-shrubbery, not about agroforestry. The clue's in the name. We need to plant big trees to cool field temperatures down. That's the only answer I can see.
I don't know if I understood the question or the comment, but I think it's important, for me to think as well that in agroforestry fields, even though we plant trees, it's not just the effect of the tree that we have in there, but also there is vegetation in the understory, which actually has a positive effect on things like soil organic matter or worms, for example, or soil water content. So it's probably a bit more complex than what it seems at first. I think it's...
You're not cooling the field temperature between the rows of trees. All you're doing is cooling the temperature below the rows of trees. So by planting tall trees, you're creating convection currents, so you're cooling the whole field.
Yes, if I can make comment on that. I think it's a very good point. And kind of the headline message I can give you is that we don't know how does it work. And I think that... Yes. I wouldn't be confident in saying if I say I plant large trees, they will shade the field. Just physics. But the large trees are going to use a lot more water, and the relationship between the size of the tree and the water use isn't linear. So at some point there will be the benefit of I have the shade from the trees, which is cooling the area, but I have the loss of water from the field because the larger trees need a lot more water. And I am not aware of anybody having looked at that. That's why. Yes. Yes. So there will be an optimum somewhere, but I don't know where exactly.
Thank you. Really interesting to listen to all that. I was just wondering, having put an agroforestry project in the ground from our organisation very speedily under grant funding, to then look back and go, oh, I wish we'd got more baseline data. But also aware of, when speaking to lots of landholders, the barriers or the particularly financial and time investment barriers in getting decent baseline in the data in the first place. You know, if you look at invertebrates, for example, getting a specialist ecologist out to do invertebrate surveys could be hugely costly and time consuming. But we're aware that we need to collect far more data to be able to feed the research behind this. I'm just wondering what all four of you really, what your advice would be to landholders that are looking to put in agroforestry. What would your advice be on kind of like key research, key baseline data, how they can go about that funding? I don't know. What's the advice to increase that collection?
Okay. That's a very good question. $1 million question. I mean, I think it depends a little bit on the interests and the resources of the farmer, because you do have farmers who are really interested and will go out and collect data themselves. If they're not prepared to do that and they want other people to collect it, or they want to get data from the cloud or the models that exist, I guess, I don't know. I'm not sure what I'd suggest. Look at what's working already on your farm to inform what you plant in the future. Look at
whether there's volunteers who can come along and collect some data. Baselining is really important, and it often doesn't happen, and without it, it's hard to tell, like you said. You got anything to add?
No, I think, as universities are a good source of this sort of thing, so contact universities, and there's always projects that can be done on an undergrad or master's or even a PhD level. So it's basically networking, speak to people, and I think universities are a good source of these little projects that can add to the knowledge base and get real data when this transformation is happening, and baseline data is vital for us, so it would be good to start as soon as possible.
Just a quick question. I'm sorry, you want to continue?
Just to add quickly to that on baselining, so if a farmer's not wanting to plant up their whole farm, it is really, really valuable as researchers to have fields that are managed in exactly the same way without trees, as we can then make those comparisons. So if they're not wanting to plant up the whole farm, encourage them to have an area that is cultivated in the same way and on the same cropping cycle. Is really useful to be able to make those comparisons. As baselining is really important, but as the climate changes, there's other factors at play as well. So, yeah.
Probably from my point of view, something that will be interesting to see as well is what will be the impact of having the trees on the crops, because it's important to have the trees, and there are several benefits, but in some cases potentially some trees could be competing with the crops, either for light or water or other resources. So something that I think it will be interesting. And from my perspective, again, given the changes in weather that we're experiencing, data on the effect of having trees in water will be very interesting to have as well. That's probably what I will suggest.
Yeah, just a quick, maybe a silly question, but it's raised some discussions in the past. I'd like just to raise it to students, PhD students. Is this, you dig worms, and I'm not a wormologist. I did some sampling on worms, but it triggered me to make a question. If you have your figures in square meters, and if you dig worms underground, I assume it's a 20 centimeter spade, it should be in cubic meter wise, like we do in carbon, depending on bulk density, you have some biomass. Why the figures are in square meters? Shouldn't they be in cubic meters somehow, related to a bulk density of the soil? Question for how do I estimate the worms biomass in a soil, especially if you're going to upscale, to calculate energy fluxes and so on. Why is it in square meter? Maybe it's a question for all the wormologists around the room.
Well, sorry, I got the micro. So, I suppose, it should be reported if what you want to report is biomass, for example. I mean, I know there are ways to measure or assess soil health is using things like visual assessments of the soil, and they basically dig a hole and they just count the worms. And this is I will say a rough indication of how many worms you have in chunk of land. But I will say yes, it probably should be expressed in cubic meters. If what you're digging is basically a cube of soil. But as I say, I'm not a specialist in worms, and I haven't done much research. But I will agree with you on that.
Anybody else?
I've done quite a bit of worm digging in the past, including some at Wakelands actually, which we should. I think we've had this conversation before as well now. I think you can express it in either, to be honest. I think it's relevant in either because it's per metre squared of ground and what's underneath it, and that depends on the depth of the soil, or it's per cubic metre.
No, I was going to say the same. You can express in both, and they just,
Yeah, it's interesting because it does seem like the norm is in metres squared. So that's why I was presenting in metres squared, because everyone else does. But it's a really important point. It's not a 2D system. And yeah, just to add that mine was going to 20 centimetres depth, and that when I'm writing this up, that would obviously be included. So could be worked out. But
yeah, it is a really good point.
Yes, just to add, I think this problem is inherent to the entirety of soil science. So it should be expressed per meter square or volume, but it very much depends on the horizon you're sampling from. And that's confusing. So maybe a percentage or something, I don't know. Anyway, question here.
Yeah, I have quite a rudimentary understanding of the chemistry of it, but from what I understand, in a woodland, the nitrogen gets locked up by the wood decomposing. Is there any impact of this in like agroforestry systems where you've got trees adjacent to arable and therefore you don't have as much nitrogen available? Is that how it works?
Some trees actively fix nitrogen, so it probably depends on your species, but not as far as I know. Anyone else?
And some crops will also fix nitrogen depending on the crop. So it depends on what is there and how that nitrogen is cycling in the system. So there's not, I don't think there is a straightforward answer to that because it will be dependent. It will be very context dependent.
Anybody else? I'll have a go. Yes, I think you hit the nail on the head. The trees take up nitrogen a lot better than the crop because they have more roots and they have more mycorrhiza. They lock it up, but one thing we rely on or think it's happening is the recycling of nitrogen via the tree. So the nitrogen will be loaded into the trees for photosynthesis, and some of it is not then recycled back into the tree before the leaves are shed. So essentially you create a nitrogen cycle inside the system, or at least that's the idea.
I'm interested how can we understand the cultural services baseline in ecosystem services as part of an agroforestry system?
Yeah, that is a problem. I don't think there is a way of measuring baseline. And to be very honest, I know very little about cultural services. I've never worked with cultural services before. And I know very little about it and how it's actually measured. So I'm not the best person to answer. And I don't know if anyone is more familiar with cultural ecosystem services.
We ran a survey 2 years ago asking farmers what benefits they perceive from agroforestry in the period of 5 to 10 years after they planted the trees. And pretty much 75% of the farmers responded that they haven't perceived increase in yields, maximizing crops, or financial benefits, but they have perceived a lot of intangible benefits, such as greater aesthetic value or opportunities for education. I think one of the problems that I see in this ecosystem services framework is that not all the ecosystem services are weighted equally, because it's very difficult in some cases to quantify financially what is the benefit of having a greater aesthetic value in a field, for example. Probably we don't really know. There might have been some models around, but it's difficult to know how do we quantify that. But it's certainly there, and I think it's something that it should be looked at more at depth if we want to have a full picture of what actually the agroforestry systems are providing beyond just soil benefits or financial benefits, but also information about, for example, mental health. People having, a nicer field to look at when they go to the countryside. So I think there is a lot of work that needs to be done. I would be very interested in doing that if somebody wants to pay me. But at the moment, I don't have the resources.
I think most of us in Reading ignored cultural services for some reason. So, but yeah, it's an area that I think is growing. There was some research, I think, in our department which showed that time and space, but not directly related to agroforestry. But I don't really know how they measure baselines in that context. But I would assume it's based on questionnaires of before and after and how you felt. But yeah, it's a good question. Sorry, we can't give you a better answer.
Sorry, it was just a quick comment following up on that one, really, which is that on our agroforestry site, it was put in next to a care farm, which is an alternative provision to schooling for children with educational needs or complex emotional needs. And what we've found, just anecdotally, purely from that at the moment, is I get constant emails from the staff team there saying that the children have been so engaged with the agroforestry field, and they love going around and counting apples, and they've had all these additional benefits. So it'd be a really interesting piece of research for our educational engagement, youth wellbeing side of things, that I'd love to have a chat if there's anything.
I think the fact that it's so hard to quantify puts people off, and that's why it's the less researched area in terms of ecosystem services.
I think that will be a very interesting baseline data you could collect before planting trees and see the impact after you plant them.
Paul Burgess, Cranfield University. I was just going to follow up on the cultural services side. In the EU project Ag Forward, we have Copenhagen University did some quite detailed work on cultural services that's been published. I guess the two headline messages are cultural services are increased where there are people, so things that you can do near population centres, that increases the cultural service benefit. And from the samples that we did, there was a general preference for people for mosaic landscapes. So landscapes with variability is what sort of people tended to favour.
Thank you for listening. We'd like to thank our lead sponsor, Sainsbury's, and our other major sponsors, Farmers Weekly Transition, Forestry Commission, and Tilhill, and all the attendees for making this show such an overwhelming success. To get advice and support for your agroforestry project, either visit woodlandtrust.org.uk/plant or soilassociation.org/agroforestry.